allegation that important legislators in defeating the Nunes plan in the basement said, quote, "We already have a nigger mayor and we don't need any more nigger big shots. We already have a nigger mayor and we don't need any more nigger big shots." I think the two-party system, although my Democratic colleagues don't like me saying this, I think the two-party system is good for the South and good for the good for the black in the South. Good for the South and good for the good for the black for the South and good for the good for the black.
It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society. It does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society.
November, we got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
It don't have nothing to do with Trump.
There are white niggers. I've seen a lot of white niggers in my time. I'm going to use that word.
Especially African Americans have really looked back on the 1994 crime bill not very fondly. Hillary Clinton herself has come out against it, even though her husband signed it into law. Well, the author of that crime bill was Joe Biden.
The Biden crime bill.
Biden's 1994 crime bill, while implementing sweeping gun control, also helped fuel mass incarceration.
I like the idea they keep in jail longer. I'm the guy that wrote the bill requiring federal judges to keep people in jail 100% of the time for which they're sentenced.
I'm ashamed that I voted for the 94 crime bill. You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. And in fact, I drafted the bill.
Biden seems primed to be at the head of a crowded Democratic 2020 field, but his role as a leading architect in America's crackdown on drugs could be a major liability for his campaign.
I think the problem with Joe Biden isn't that he was a passenger on the drug war train, he was driving it.
In 1988, as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Biden co-sponsored the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. The bill led to new mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders and created a sentencing rule that led to stiffer punishments for crack cocaine users than those who used powder cocaine. In 1989, when then-President George H.W. Bush called for $8 billion to help law enforcement in the war against drugs, Biden said it was inadequate and called for stricter punishments for both drug users and dealers.
The president says he wants to wage a war on drugs, but if that's true, what we need is another D-Day, not another Vietnam, not another limited war fought on the cheap and destined for stalemate and human tragedy.
Then in 1994, Biden spearheaded the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, a bill that touched nearly every aspect of law enforcement and is credited for leading to a boom in for-profit prisons and mass incarceration. And while every other candidate in the 2020 Democratic primary supports marijuana legalization or decriminalization, Biden hasn't jumped on the 420 bandwagon yet. His position on marijuana itself hasn't wavered much over the years. In 2010, he said legalization would be a mistake, and he's been relatively mum on the issue since.
Any person today who is a serious candidate for any high elected office, who doesn't really look at marijuana, at least decriminalization, if not legalization, as what is needed in this country as a baseline, if somebody doesn't take that position, it's going to be really hard for them to convince people who have criminal justice reform as a top issue that they're a serious candidate.
Crime bill. It's time to repeal it. And it's abundantly clear putting more people in prison hasn't made us safer. What it has done is decimate communities of color and rip families and communities like mine apart. The 1994 crime bill was written by a bunch of politicians who wanted to show they were tough on crime. So they passed mandatory minimums and tougher sentences, 3 strikes and you're out laws, and many more arrests for drug offenses. The bill gave states billions of dollars to build more prisons and keep people in prison longer. The result, the crime bill has filled our nation's prisons and jails with our fellow Americans, most of them Black or Latino.
De Blasio joins me now. Mr. Mayor, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Elaine.
So in an opinion column in Thursday's New York Times, Bret Stephens says Joe Biden should be proud of the crime bill because it helped make the country safer. You disagree with that. Why?
Yeah, Elaine, Bret Stephens wrote that column. He couldn't have been more wrong, and he absolutely ignored the hundreds of thousands of Americans unjustly sent to prison for long periods of time, the families torn apart, the effects of mass incarceration we are feeling to this day in New York and all over this country. And look, the crime bill was the foundation of that horrible era of mass incarceration. Look at the fact that so many people who had committed very minor offenses were sent away for so long. Look at the fact that the bill had a disproportionate impact on African Americans and Latinos, and again had a horrible impact on families that we're still feeling the effects of right now. That bill was a huge mistake, and we got to be clear about it, and we can never go back to mass incarceration.
Somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids. I sit on the stand and it get hot. I got hairy legs that turn blonde in the sun. And the kids used to come up and reach in the pool and rub my leg down so it was straight, and then watch the hair come back up again. They'd look at it. So I learned about roaches. I learned about kids jumping on my lap. And I've loved kids jumping on my lap. So I learned about roaches. I learned about kids jumping on my lap. And I've loved kids jumping on my lap.
Well, let me ask you this. You've also been criticized about your interactions with women. 7 women accused you of touching them without their permission. While they didn't say it crossed the line into sexual harassment, they did say that you made them feel uncomfortable. And many have been critical about how you've handled it since the accusations. Even Speaker Nancy Pelosi said this. She said, to say I'm sorry you were offended is not an apology. It's I'm sorry I invaded your space. Now, you have come out and said, I get it, especially because we're in a different time now. We're in the Me Too movement. But are you sorry for what you did? Are you prepared to apologize to those women?
Look, here's the deal. I have to be, and everybody has to be, much more aware of the private space of men and women. It's not just women, but primarily women. And I am much more cognizant of that. But I am so, like, for example, I actually thought in my head when I walked out here. That's my responsibility. I have to be more aware, and it's totally legitimate for someone not to have to say, no, don't get in my private space. It's my job. It's my job to read that, no, this is space that no one wants me to invade.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think it's legitimate, and I think it is, and to anyone. But I don't think anyone's ever said that I invaded their space in a way that was designed to do something other than making them feel uncomfortable, but not anything having to do with harassment or anything else.
Right, they have said that, but they've also said we'd like an apology.
Well, look, I'm really sorry if what I did in talking to them to console, that in fact they took it a different way. And it's my responsibility to make sure that I bend over backwards to try to understand how not to do that.
Nancy Pelosi wants you to say, I'm sorry that I invaded your space.
Sorry I invaded your space. I mean, I'm sorry this happened.
A year ago, Reid was among several women who said Biden had touched them inappropriately in a non-sexual manner, describing being asked to bring then-Senator Joe Biden a gym bag in a Senate office building.
He greeted me, he remembered my name, and then I said, you know, here you go, Senator. I handed him the bag, and it happened very quickly.
She alleges Biden pushed her up against the wall of a Senate corridor and put his hand under her clothes.
He had his hands underneath my clothes, and it happened all at once. He had one hand underneath my shirt, and the other hand I had a skirt on, and he went down my skirt and then went up.
Reid claiming Biden pulled back when she resisted.
He pointed his finger at me and he said, "You're nothing to me. You're nothing."
Fake news. This is the thing. I know people don't like Trump. I understand that. But let me tell you something. If I had to pick between him and Joe Biden, I'm not voting in Joe Biden. You want to see a bunch of black people go to jail by the next 4 years? Put Joe Biden in. Watch what happens. You want to see black men get killed substantially? Like you've never seen before? Put Joe Biden in and watch what happens. These Democrats, and I'm sorry to say this, I'm not trying to be racist, but they hate black people.